Please help us." The little black girl begged the biker while a door slam echoed behind her without warning. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A quiet night had settled over the city, and the hum of life seemed distant under the moonlit sky. But in a small alley, not far from the noisy streets, a little black girl was running for her life. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted toward the only place she knew could offer her safety. Her tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The echo of hurried footsteps behind her sent a chill down her spine. She had no idea how close they were, but she could hear them, creeping closer with every passing second. Desperation and fear coursed through her veins, and all she could think about was getting to the bikers. They were her last hope. Her small body stumbled as she ran, barely managing to keep her balance. She saw the bright lights of a biker bar in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat as she neared the entrance, and with all her might, she pushed the door open, the sound of it slamming behind her like a warning to whoever was chasing her. Inside, the bikers sat in their usual spots, the room filled with the smell of leather and motor oil. The atmosphere was tense, but they were used to strangers walking in. What they didn't expect, though, was the frightened little girl who ran up to them, breathless and trembling. "Please, help us," she gasped, clutching the sleeve of one of the biker's jackets. Her voice was shaky, and her words barely escaped her lips. They're coming for us." The biker, a man named Jack, looked down at the child with confusion and concern. "Who's coming for you, little one?" he asked gently, kneeling down to her level. But the girl could barely speak. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting it to open at any moment. She had to warn them. She had to tell them what was happening. The bikers were not strangers to danger, but this situation felt different. They could see the fear in the girl's eyes and the urgency in her voice. Something was wrong. Jack stood up, his leather vest creaking as he made a decision. "All right, we'll help you. Tell us everything." The little girl's story came out in fits and starts, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Her mother had been in trouble, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. And now, the people who had been tormenting her were after the girl, too. As Jack listened, he felt a deep sense of duty awaken in him. The girl was someone's child, someone who had trusted him to do the right thing. Without another word, he called to his crew, the other bikers who had gathered around the table. "We're going after them," he said, his voice cold and resolute. The group nodded in unison, already moving to gather their things. As the door slammed shut behind them, the sound of roaring engines filled the air, signaling the start of a dangerous journey. This was no longer just a ride for fun or freedom. This was a mission to protect a child who had nowhere else to turn. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The bikers wasted no time. As soon as the girl, whose name was now revealed to be Aisha, finished her fragmented story, Jack was already giving orders. "We're heading out now," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. His crew was accustomed to quick decisions, and within seconds, the engines of the Harleys roared to life. The sound of the engines filling the air as the bikes lined up in perfect formation. Aisha was still shaking, clutching Jack's vest, her small frame trembling with fear. But Jack could feel a protective instinct stirring inside him that he couldn't ignore. "You're safe now," he said softly, looking down at the girl who had been running for her life just moments ago. Aisha nodded, her wide eyes still searching the darkness around her. She could hear the engines of the Harleys, there, sound powerful and almost comforting. But that didn't stop the fear that gripped her. She had seen the look in the eyes of the men who had been chasing her, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her back. The bikers sped down the road, the headlights illuminating the path ahead. As they traveled, the distance between them and the city grew, the streets becoming emptier and the landscape more desolate. The once busy roads now seemed eerily quiet, with only the sound of their bikes breaking the stillness of the night. Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, making sure no one was tailing them. His hand tightened on the throttle. The wind rushed past him, carrying away the lingering thoughts of what might happen if they didn't make it in time. As the miles ticked by, Aisha stayed close to Jack, her small body pressed against his back, her hands gripping the leather tightly. Every bump in the road made her flinch. Every shadow that passed by made her heart race. She couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder, expecting to see the men from earlier. But there was nothing. The bikers kept their speed steady, making sure to stay alert as they moved further away from the city. It wasn't long before they reached a quieter, more isolated stretch of highway. The road stretched on for miles with nothing but the occasional farmhouse or dilapidated building dotting the landscape. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon. He knew the area well, having passed through these roads more times than he cared to count. But tonight, it felt different. There was an urgency in the air, a sense of impending danger that weighed heavily on him. Aisha's fear was palpable, and Jack could feel it in his gut. He had seen it before. He had seen it in the eyes of children caught in situations beyond their control. This was no different. The girl needed protection, and he would make sure she got it, no matter the cost. They reached a crossroads after what felt like hours. The group slowed, the rumbling of the engines dying down as they approached a small, seemingly abandoned house. It was the type of place you wouldn't stop at unless you had to. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. A rusted-out car sat by the side of the house, the paint peeling and the tires deflated. "This is it," Jack said, his voice low. The bikers parked their bikes in a tight formation around the house, creating a protective circle. They didn't know what they were walking into, but they were ready for anything. Aisha got off the bike with Jack's help, her legs unsteady as she stood on the ground. She was still shaking, but she didn't speak. She was too terrified. Jack motioned for his crew to stay alert as they approached the front door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the empty night. No one answered. "Something's off," Wrench, one of the bikers, muttered as he inspected the area around the house. Jack nodded. He could feel it too. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound it made amplifying the tension in the air. The inside of the house was dark, except for a dim light coming from the far corner. Dust and cobwebs lined the walls, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Jack stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. His eyes scanned the room quickly, searching for any signs of life. And then he saw it. A figure lying motionless on the floor. Aisha's mother, her frail body stretched out in the corner, barely moving. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was pale, almost gray. "She's been drugged," Vince, one of the bikers with medical experience, said as he knelt beside the woman. He checked her pulse, his face hardening. "She's alive, but barely." Jack's heart sank as he looked down at the woman. He could tell she had been through hell. Aisha's mother, once a woman full of life, was now nothing more than a shell of her former self. Jack glanced back at Aisha, who was standing at the door, her hands trembling as she stared at her mother. "We need to get her out of here," Jack said, his voice steady but urgent. Vince nodded, already pulling out a small medical kit. The bikers knew they couldn't stay here long. The longer they were in this place, the more dangerous it would become. Aisha's mother was in no condition to be moved, but they had no choice. They needed to get her help, and they needed to do it quickly. Jack turned to the rest of the group. "We're moving out now. We need to get her to a hospital." The bikers readied themselves, their hands on their bikes, their eyes sharp. The night was far from over, and Jack knew it. The hardest part was still ahead of them. But he wasn't going to let anyone hurt Aisha or her mother, not while he was still breathing. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt as the bikers geared up, their machines rumbling like distant thunder. The air was thick with tension, each of them knowing that time was running out. Jack stood at the front, his jaw set, eyes focused on the road ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone, or something, was out there, waiting. Aisha was silent beside him, her small frame clinging to his back as the engine roared beneath them. She had been so quiet since they left the house, her wide eyes lost in the chaos of the world around her. It was as if the night had stolen all the energy from her, leaving her in a daze, unsure of what was coming next. But Jack could feel her fear, even without a word. They had reached the outskirts of town, and Jack signaled for the group to slow down. The quiet was almost deafening. He could see the open road stretching ahead, but something in his gut told him it was too quiet. They stopped at an intersection, the dust swirling around their bikes. "Stay alert," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know how close they are." The bikers nodded, eyes scanning the area, every sense on high alert. The sound of an engine echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of a vehicle coming their way, and it wasn't slowing down. "We've got company," Wrench, one of the bikers, muttered. The rest of the group tensed, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Jack's mind raced as he looked around, trying to figure out where they could hide, how they could protect Aisha and her mother. "Everyone get off the road," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "We don't have much time." They quickly maneuvered their bikes onto a side road, disappearing behind a cluster of trees and old abandoned buildings. The engine noise grew louder, and Jack's heart rate spiked. He knew they couldn't afford to be seen. A few seconds later, the silver SUV appeared at the intersection, its headlights cutting through the morning fog. The vehicle slowed as it passed by, and Jack's stomach twisted in knots. They were here. The same men who had been chasing Aisha, the same men who had terrorized her family. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars. They had to be ready for anything. The SUV didn't stop, continuing down the road, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they turned around and came back. "We need to move fast," Jack said, his voice tight. "We're heading to the nearest safe house." The bikers revved their engines, their machines roaring to life once more as they sped off in pursuit of the SUV. The wind hit them hard, the cold air biting at their skin as they weaved through the empty streets. Every muscle in Jack's body was tense, his focus unbreakable. He could see the SUV up ahead, the taillights blinking as it picked up speed. The race was on. As they neared a narrow stretch of road, Jack saw the SUV take a sharp turn ahead, cutting through an alleyway that led to the old industrial area. "They're trying to lose us," Jack muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "Don't let them out of your sight." The bikers followed in perfect formation, not giving the SUV an inch of space. They knew the area well, having ridden these roads countless times, but tonight, everything felt different. The stakes were higher. They weren't just chasing down a group of criminals. They were chasing down a group of people who would stop at nothing to hurt a little girl and her family. They reached the industrial area, the buildings towering over them like dark giants in the night. The roads here were narrow, filled with potholes and debris, but it didn't matter. The bikers had one goal: catch the men before they could do any more damage. The SUV had disappeared into the maze of warehouses, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if they had entered a trap or if they were still ahead, but he knew one thing. They had to catch them. "Spread out," Jack commanded. "We're going in hot." They split into smaller groups, each taking a different route through the industrial district, their headlights cutting through the shadows like searchlights. Jack's eyes flickered over every corner, every alley, as he and Wrench headed toward the far side of the district. They could hear the faint sound of tires screeching ahead, and Jack's pulse quickened. They were close. They turned a corner just in time to see the SUV speeding toward them, the engine growling with raw power. Jack and Wrench barely had time to react as the vehicle came barreling toward them, its headlights blinding. Jack swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision, as the SUV screeched to a halt just feet away. "They've got nowhere to go," Jack said, his voice low. "This is it." The rest of the bikers closed in, surrounding the SUV from all sides. The driver of the SUV froze, realizing they had nowhere to run. Jack pulled up alongside the vehicle, his hand resting on the side of his bike. He leaned over, his eyes locking with the terrified driver. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice cold and unwavering. The driver's face turned pale as he realized what was happening. The rest of the men in the SUV were already reaching for their weapons, but it was too late. The bikers were already on them. Jack didn't wait for them to make a move. He reached for his own gun, his finger tight on the trigger, as the first shot rang out into the night. The air was thick with tension as the dust settled. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in the quiet night. The driver of the SUV had not expected the bikers to react so quickly, so decisively. Jack's hand was still on his gun, his eyes scanning the men in the SUV. They were trapped now. The engine of his Harley hummed beneath him, but he didn't move just yet. He had to make sure everything was under control. The men in the SUV looked terrified. They had nowhere to go. The headlights of the bikes illuminated their faces, showing their panic. "Get out of the car," Jack ordered, his voice cold, every word carrying weight. The driver hesitated, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. The other men in the SUV were now looking around, weighing their options. But Jack wasn't giving them a choice. "Now," he repeated, his voice firm. One by one, the men stepped out of the SUV, their hands raised in surrender. Jack's crew spread out, surrounding them, ready for anything. The situation was tense, but Jack wasn't taking any chances. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his focus sharper than ever. Aisha had stayed behind with one of the bikers, clutching his jacket tightly as she watched the scene unfold. She was still shaking, her small frame hidden behind the large leather jacket. Jack could see the fear in her eyes. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He couldn't fail her now. He had promised her father he would protect her, and that promise was a debt he intended to pay. As the men from the SUV were forced to kneel on the ground, Jack stepped forward, his eyes locked on the one who appeared to be in charge. The man's hands trembled as he faced Jack, his fear palpable. "What do you want from us?" the man asked, his voice shaking. Jack didn't answer right away. He was still processing everything. They had been following them for hours, making sure Aisha was safe. But now, they had to deal with the aftermath. "You've been hurting people," Jack said coldly, "and you're not getting away with it." The man gulped, looking over at his companions. Jack could see the guilt in his eyes. They all knew they had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. "We didn't mean to," the man began, but Jack cut him off. "Save it. You've already done enough." Jack motioned for the others to keep their eyes on the men. He turned to the rest of his crew, signaling for them to prepare for whatever was next. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. The cops were already on their way, and they couldn't afford to be caught in the middle of a confrontation. "We need to move," Jack said. His voice was steady, even as the adrenaline still buzzed in his veins. "Get them in the truck." Two of the bikers moved quickly, forcing the men into the back of a truck they had commandeered earlier. The truck's engine roared to life, and they drove off in silence, the bikers following in their formation. The air was tense, but Jack could feel the weight of the mission lifting. They were getting closer to their goal, but the night wasn't over yet. As the truck sped through the streets, Jack's mind raced. He kept thinking about Aisha, about the promise he had made to her father. He couldn't let her down. He had to make sure she was safe. He glanced over at her. She was still quiet, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. She hadn't said a word since they left the house. Jack could see the strain in her eyes, the fear that still lingered in her. He couldn't imagine what she was going through. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice a comfort in the chaos. Aisha didn't respond. She just nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the road ahead. Jack knew she was processing everything in her own way. It would take time for her to feel safe again. The rest of the ride was quiet. The bikers kept their formation, moving through the night like a storm, making sure no one followed them. Jack stayed at the front, his eyes scanning every street and alley, ensuring they weren't being tracked. They passed through several quiet neighborhoods, the lights of the city now behind them. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The closer they got to the safe house, the more nervous he became. He had no idea what to expect once they got there. They had made it this far, but there was still so much at stake. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of town. The safe house was a small, unmarked building tucked away behind a row of warehouses. Jack signaled for the bikers to stop, and they did, parking their bikes in a tight circle. The truck came to a halt, and the men from the SUV were quickly ushered inside the building. Jack stayed behind, keeping an eye on Aisha. She had finally relaxed, her body no longer trembling. He could tell that she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He could see the weight of everything she had been through in her eyes. "We're here," Jack said gently, helping her off the bike. She nodded, looking up at the building in front of her. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now, that was all that mattered. As they walked into the building, Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had made it. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, and he would do whatever it took to protect Aisha and make sure her family was safe. The dim light of the safe house flickered as Jack closed the door behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses down on you after a long, exhausting journey. Aisha, still holding tightly to Jack's leather jacket, stood in the middle of the room, her eyes darting around as she tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Jack could see the weariness in her face, the weight of the night taking its toll on her. He didn't know how to make it better, how to ease her fears. All he could do was offer his protection, and that felt like a fragile promise. "You're safe now," Jack repeated, his voice soft but firm. The words were meant to reassure, to break the tension in the air, but he could see that Aisha wasn't convinced. She nodded slowly, her eyes still distant. She hadn't spoken much since they left the industrial district, and Jack respected that. She needed time to process. The bikers were in the back, securing the building and making sure there were no surprises. Jack had given the order to keep watch, but his mind kept drifting back to Aisha. She had seen too much, too fast. No child should ever have to go through what she had. He couldn't help but think about her father, the man he had made a promise to all those years ago. Tyrone had been more than just a friend. He had been a brother, someone Jack had shared the darkest parts of his past with. And now, as he stood here, protecting Tyrone's daughter, Jack felt that bond more than ever. "You're doing the right thing," Wrench's voice broke into Jack's thoughts. Wrench, one of the older bikers, had a way of reading people, and Jack knew he could always rely on him for the blunt truth. Jack turned to him, his brow furrowed. "She's just a kid, Wrench. She's been through hell." Wrench gave a slow nod. "I know, but you're not just helping her, Jack. You're honoring a promise." Jack turned away, looking at Aisha, who was sitting on a makeshift cot in the corner of the room. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, and she had her arms wrapped tightly around them. She looked so small, so fragile. A shadow crossed the doorway, and Jack looked up to see one of the bikers, Phantom, step inside. Phantom was a tall, quiet man with a sharp mind and a sharper sense of loyalty. "We've got eyes on the perimeter," Phantom said, his voice low and calm. "No sign of them yet, but we're not taking any chances." Jack nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew the Serpents would come for them eventually. They always did. And when they did, Jack had no intention of letting them take Aisha or her mother. He would burn everything to the ground before that happened. The silence in the room stretched on, only broken by the soft rustling of Aisha shifting on her cot. Jack felt the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the stakes. Tyrone had asked him to protect his family, and Jack was damn well going to do it. He had failed so many people in his life, but he wouldn't fail this time. Not this little girl. "She needs to know we're here for her," Wrench said, stepping closer. "She's been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. We need to give her hope." Jack looked back at Aisha. Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of something in them. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was just the need for something, anything, to hold on to. But it was enough. It was a start. Jack approached her slowly, kneeling down beside her. "Hey," he said gently, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I know this has been a lot to take in. You've been through more than a kid should ever have to go through, but you're not alone anymore." Aisha didn't respond at first. She just looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with a sadness that no child her age should ever have to carry. Jack's heart tightened. "I'm not going anywhere. We've got your back. You're safe now." Aisha finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what if they come back?" she asked, her fear still evident in her tone. Jack didn't hesitate. "If they come back, we'll be ready," he said firmly. "We're not letting them take you or your mom. I promise you that." Aisha seemed to relax slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a bit. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. Jack stood up, looking around the room. He could feel the eyes of the bikers on him, their silent support a heavy weight on his shoulders. But it was also comforting. He wasn't alone in this. They weren't alone. "We're going to keep you safe, Aisha," Jack said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We'll keep you safe, no matter what it takes." Phantom and Wrench exchanged glances, both of them understanding the weight of Jack's words. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then, in unison, the bikers turned back to their tasks, the quiet hum of their movements a reassurance that they were all in this together. The road ahead was uncertain. They didn't know when or where the Serpents would strike next. But one thing was clear. Jack wasn't going to let them take Aisha, not while he was still breathing. The morning light had just started to break through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of the safe house. Jack sat by the door, his eyes scanning the empty street outside, the low hum of the city barely audible from where they were hiding. His mind raced as he thought about what was coming. The Serpents were out there, and they weren't just going to give up. They had made it clear that they were willing to do whatever it took to get to Aisha and her mother. Jack couldn't allow that. He had promised Tyrone, and he wasn't going to fail now. Aisha was asleep on a cot in the corner of the room, her body curled into a tight ball, still worn out from the ordeal. Jack watched her for a moment, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. She had been through more in a few hours than most people experience in a lifetime. But she was safe, for now, and that was all that mattered. His attention was drawn to the sound of footsteps approaching the door. He stood up, ready to move at a moment's notice, but it was just Wrench, his trusted companion, stepping into the room. "Everything's quiet for now," Wrench said, his voice low but steady. "But we've got to move soon. We can't keep Aisha here for too long. It's too exposed." Jack nodded. He knew Wrench was right. They had to stay ahead of the Serpents, and the longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. "We leave in an hour," Jack replied, his voice firm. "We'll head for the cabin up north. It's isolated, and we can lay low there until things cool down." Wrench gave a nod of approval, then turned to check on the rest of the bikers who were securing the perimeter. Jack moved toward Aisha, kneeling beside her cot. He gently shook her shoulder, careful not to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Jack saw the same fear that had been there the night before. But there was also a spark of hope. Aisha was stronger than Jack had given her credit for. "Hey kid," he said softly. "We're going to get out of here. I need you to stay close and stay quiet, all right?" Aisha nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to a safe place," Jack answered, offering her a reassuring smile. "You'll be safe there, I promise." Aisha didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Jack could see the trust in her eyes, the silent understanding that he would do whatever it took to protect her. It wasn't much, but it was everything to him. An hour later, the bikers were ready to go. They had packed their gear, checked their weapons, and made sure the safe house was locked down. Jack led the way as they mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life, breaking the quiet of the morning. The road stretched out ahead of them, empty and desolate, but Jack knew that it wouldn't stay that way for long. As they rode, Jack couldn't help but glance back at Aisha, who was riding with Wrench. She had her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She looked so small, so fragile, but there was something else there too. Something that made Jack believe she could survive this. The bikers rode in formation, their engines roaring as they sped down the empty highway. The air was cool against Jack's face, the wind whipping through his hair as they cut through the quiet morning. The farther they went, the more tense the atmosphere became. Jack kept a close eye on the rearview mirror, knowing that at any moment, the Serpents could be on their tail. They had to get to the cabin fast, but Jack wasn't about to rush. He wasn't going to take unnecessary risks. The ride took them through winding roads, past abandoned houses and overgrown fields, until they finally reached the secluded cabin that would be their temporary refuge. The place was off the grid, tucked away in a forested area far from civilization. It was the perfect place to lay low. The bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the dirt with a satisfying thud. Jack turned to Aisha, who had already climbed off Wrench's bike. She was staring at the cabin, her face a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. "This is it," Jack said, motioning toward the cabin. "We'll stay here for a while, keep our heads down. You're safe now." Aisha nodded again, her eyes scanning the area. She had grown quiet again, but Jack could see the spark of relief in her expression. She was starting to believe it. The bikers set up camp around the cabin, securing the area and making sure there were no signs of anyone following them. Jack and Wrench moved inside the cabin, where they would take turns keeping watch. The rest of the crew started making the place livable, setting up makeshift beds, and checking the supply of food and water. Aisha was sitting near the window, looking out at the trees. Jack could see the weight of the world still on her shoulders, but she was holding it together. He had to admit, he was impressed. No child should have to endure what she had, but somehow, she was finding the strength to keep going. Jack stepped over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Aisha looked up at him, and for the first time in hours, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. I think so, she said quietly. Thank you. Jack's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not on his watch. The cabin was quiet. The wind outside rustled through the trees, but inside, the only sound was the occasional crackle from the fire burning in the corner of the room. Jack sat by the window, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, alert for any movement. He had been through this many times before, keeping watch, waiting for the worst, but this time felt different. This time, there was something personal at stake. Aisha. He glanced at her, sitting by the table with her mother, who had finally regained some color after their stay in the cabin. She still wasn't fully recovered, but the worst was over. For now, at least. Jack couldn't shake the image of Aisha's face when she first came into the cabin. That was a child who had seen too much. A child who had been through too much. He was going to make sure she never had to see that kind of danger again. But there was always the possibility that the Serpents would find them. Jack had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. We're staying here for now, Jack said, his voice low as he addressed the crew. But we need to be prepared. They'll come looking for us. We can't stay here forever. Wrench, who had been quietly keeping watch by the door, nodded. We'll be ready, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. But we can't move until she's stable. We don't want to rush this. Jack glanced at Aisha again. She looked like she was finally beginning to relax, but Jack knew it was just a matter of time before the fear crept back in. She had already lost so much. He couldn't let her lose anymore. The silence between the bikers was heavy. It wasn't often that they found themselves in a situation like this, and Jack could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting a child. He was protecting a piece of his past. Tyrone's daughter. His promise to a fallen friend. The thought of breaking that promise made Jack's blood run cold. As they sat in the cabin, Jack couldn't help but think about the future. What would happen next? He had no answers. But he knew that, for now, they were safe. They had time to regroup, time to plan. He turned his attention back to Aisha, who was now sitting on the floor, drawing something in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Hey Aisha, Jack called softly. She looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was something in her gaze, something that told him she was still fighting, still holding on. How you doing? He asked, his voice gentle. Aisha hesitated, then shrugged. I'm okay, she said quietly. It's just, I don't know. Jack sat down next to her, keeping his voice calm and steady. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, he said. But just know, you're safe now. We'll make sure you stay safe. Aisha didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, almost as if she was speaking to herself more than to Jack, she said, I don't remember much about what happened before. But I remember my dad, and I remember he told me to trust you. Jack's heart clenched. He trusted me, Jack said softly, almost to himself. And I promised him I'd look after you. I'm going to keep that promise, Aisha. You don't have to worry anymore. Aisha nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She didn't speak again, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. There was a quiet understanding, a bond that had formed in the chaos of the past few hours. Jack stood up, looking out the window again. The forest was still, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. They were safe, for now. But Jack knew the peace would be short-lived. The Serpents wouldn't give up so easily. They would come for Aisha. It was only a matter of time. He turned to Wrench, who had been keeping watch by the door. We're not staying here forever, Jack said. We'll move out tomorrow morning, head toward the next safe house. We need to keep moving. Wrench nodded. Got it. But we need to be ready for anything. If they come after us, we'll be ready to fight. Jack felt a surge of pride for his crew. They were loyal, dedicated, and they knew how to handle a fight. But Jack wasn't just worried about the fight. He was worried about Aisha. She had already been through too much. We'll make sure she's safe, Jack said, his voice steady. No matter what. As the bikers prepared for the next phase of their journey, Jack stayed close to Aisha. He watched her as she drew, her small fingers tracing lines in the dirt. For a moment, he saw a glimpse of the girl she could be, a girl who had not yet lost everything. That was the girl Jack was fighting for, and he wouldn't stop until she was safe. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the cabin in darkness. Jack stood by the window, watching the shadows grow longer, feeling the weight of the promise he had made. The serpents were coming, and he would be ready. The next morning, the bikers packed up their gear and prepared to leave. Jack stood at the front of the cabin, looking out at the horizon. The sun had barely risen, and the cool air filled his lungs as he took a deep breath. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving. He glanced over at Aisha, who was sitting on the porch, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked calm now, but Jack could see the tension in her eyes. The fear was still there, hidden behind the calm facade. It was understandable. She had been through so much already, and the threat of the serpents still loomed over them. Jack walked over to her, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. "You ready to go?" he asked gently. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes soft but still wary. "I guess," she said quietly. "I just want to stay here. I don't want to go back to those people." Jack's heart ached as he knelt down beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm but kind. "I know, kid, but we can't stay here. It's not safe. We'll keep moving until we get you somewhere safe. I promise." Aisha nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stood up slowly, her small figure moving toward the bikes. Jack watched her for a moment before turning back to his crew. "All right, let's move out. We've got a long ride ahead of us." The bikers mounted their bikes, and the engines roared to life, echoing through the quiet woods. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The journey was long, and the tension was palpable. Aisha rode behind Wrench, her arms tightly wrapped around his waist. Jack glanced back at her a few times, making sure she was all right. He couldn't help but worry about her. She had already seen too much, and now they were heading into even more danger. But this was the only option. They had to keep moving. The road stretched out ahead of them, winding through the thick forest. Jack kept his focus on the path, his senses heightened, but his mind kept returning to Aisha. She had been so strong, so brave, but Jack knew the toll it was taking on her. She had lost everything, and now she was running, just like they were. The day passed slowly as they rode, the heat of the sun beating down on them. They stopped for gas and food, but the whole time, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, he expected to see headlights behind them, but there was nothing. Still, Jack couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. As the sun began to set, they reached a small town. It was quieter here, the streets empty, save for a few cars passing by. Jack pulled the group over and signaled for them to park in a secluded area near a rundown diner. "We'll rest here for the night," Jack said, his voice low. "Get some food, stretch our legs, and then we'll keep moving in the morning." The bikers dismounted, stretching their tired limbs. Jack glanced around, his instincts on high alert. The last thing they needed was to attract attention. They needed to blend in, to remain unnoticed. Aisha slipped off Wrench's bike and walked toward the diner, her head down, eyes scanning the ground. Jack watched her for a moment before following her inside. The diner was small and quiet, the only sounds coming from the clinking of silverware and low conversations. Jack found a corner booth and sat down, keeping his back to the wall. Aisha slid into the booth across from him, her gaze distant. "You all right?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. She nodded without looking up. "Just tired," she said quietly. Jack could see that she wasn't just tired. There was something more to it, something she wasn't saying. But he didn't press. He knew she would talk when she was ready. A waitress came over to take their order. Jack ordered a coffee, and Aisha asked for water. The waitress nodded and walked away. Jack sat back, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here long. The serpents were out there, and they were getting closer. Jack had no doubt they would come for them soon. It was only a matter of time. As they waited for their food, Jack turned his attention to the rest of the bikers, who were scattered around the diner, keeping an eye on the entrance and the surrounding area. He could see the same look in their eyes. Everyone was on edge. They all knew what was coming. The silence stretched on, and Jack's thoughts drifted to Aisha again. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in so many faces before. He had seen it in the eyes of children who had been torn from their families, in the eyes of victims who had nowhere left to turn. But he had never seen it in Aisha's eyes before. Not until now. The food came, and they ate quickly. Jack kept his focus on the door, watching for any sign of trouble. As they finished, Jack stood up, his mind already on the next move. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. "Now." The bikers stood up, grabbing their jackets and heading toward the door. Aisha followed Jack, her small figure lost in the crowd of bikers. They all filed out of the diner and mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life once again. Jack led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The road ahead was uncertain, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until Aisha was safe. The road was empty, the hum of the engines the only sound in the quiet night. The bikers kept a steady pace, their eyes scanning the road ahead. Jack led the group, his focus unshakable, knowing that every mile brought them closer to safety, but also closer to danger. The Serpents wouldn't stop until they had Aisha, and Jack wasn't about to let that happen. The sky was darkening as they made their way through the winding country roads. The landscape was quiet, the occasional farmhouse breaking the monotony of the trees and fields. It felt like they were alone in the world, but Jack knew that wasn't true. He had a feeling the Serpents were closing in. Aisha was riding behind Wrench, her small body tucked securely against his back. She hadn't said much since the diner, and Jack could see the fear still in her eyes. She was doing her best to stay strong, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before the weight of everything caught up with her. He couldn't blame her. The world had already taken so much from her. The road stretched ahead, endless and winding, but Jack wasn't going to stop. Not now. They couldn't afford to slow down. He glanced back, his gaze lingering on Aisha for a moment, before turning his attention back to the road. They had to get to the safe house, the place where they could regroup, plan their next move, and hopefully, get some rest. Jack had been running on fumes for days, but he couldn't let his guard down. Not until Aisha was completely safe. The hours passed, the road ahead unchanged, but Jack could feel the tension rising. They were getting closer to the safe house, but there was something in the air, something that didn't sit right. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they were being followed. Jack's mind raced as he thought about their options. They couldn't stay on the road for much longer, but the safe house was their only chance to regroup. He had to get them there. They were nearing a small town, the lights in the distance offering a brief respite from the endless dark. Jack signaled for the bikers to slow down, his instincts telling him to be cautious. He wasn't sure why, but something didn't feel right. Stay sharp, Jack said over the comms, his voice low. We don't know who's out there. Wrench nodded, his grip tightening on the handlebars. He could sense the unease in Jack's voice. The other bikers were on high alert, their eyes scanning every shadow. Jack's heart was pounding now, his mind racing as they neared the edge of the town. The small streets were deserted, the only sign of life the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. They had almost made it, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. As they passed an alley, Jack's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. There it was. A black car. It was too far behind to be a threat yet, but Jack's instincts screamed at him. It was a Serpents car. He could tell. The license plate was almost impossible to make out, but the car's profile was unmistakable. It was following them. Jack's hand tightened around the throttle. We've got company, he said, his voice steady. We need to move faster. The bikers picked up the pace, but Jack could feel the car gaining on them. The black car was like a shadow, always there, never far behind. He could see the headlights flickering in the distance, getting closer with every passing second. Jack's mind was working quickly, calculating their options. They had to lose the car. They had to get to the safe house, but if the Serpents caught up to them, they wouldn't get the chance. The road ahead was narrowing, the streetlights fewer and farther between. Jack turned onto a side street, hoping to lose the car in the maze of buildings. The bikers followed his lead, their bikes weaving through the narrow alleys. But the black car didn't fall behind. It was still there, tailing them, and Jack knew they had to act fast. They're not going to stop, Wrench said, his voice tense. We need to make a stand. Jack nodded, his mind working at full speed. They were coming up on a dead end. A short street that led to a cul-de-sac. It was their only option. They had to turn and face the Serpents head-on. Jack's heart was pounding as they reached the end of the street. The bikers had already slowed, taking position in a semicircle around the entrance. The black car pulled up, its engine growling as it came to a stop in front of them. The driver didn't get out. The car's headlights cast an eerie glow on the road, blinding Jack and the others for a moment. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The Serpents weren't here to talk. Jack knew that. They had come for Aisha, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. "Get out of the car," Jack said, his voice firm. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to back down. The door of the black car creaked open, and one by one, the men stepped out. They were armed. Of course they were. Jack's hand hovered near his sidearm, but he didn't draw it just yet. He needed to stay calm. He needed to make this count. "You're not getting her," Jack said, his voice low and steady. The Serpents didn't move, but Jack could see the glint of malice in their eyes. This wasn't just about Aisha anymore. This was about power. The men took a step forward, but Jack was ready. "Back off," he said. His voice was a warning, and this time, the bikers around him moved into position, their bodies tense and ready. This was it. The final confrontation. Jack had no idea how it would end, but he was ready to do whatever it took to protect Aisha. The air was thick with tension, the night unnaturally quiet. The Serpents stood in front of Jack and his crew, their eyes filled with contempt and malice. The black car's engine still hummed behind them, its headlights casting long shadows across the narrow street. Jack could hear the soft sounds of the wind through the trees, the faint rustle of leaves as the world held its breath. He had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it was different than he had imagined. The Serpents weren't just after Aisha. They were sending a message. Jack had no intention of letting them take her. "You know what this is about," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You're not getting her." The leader of the Serpents, a man named Viper, stepped forward, his face a mask of arrogance. "You think you can stop us?" Viper sneered, his voice low and mocking. "We've been tracking you for days. You can't run from us forever." Jack didn't flinch. His crew had already taken their positions, spreading out in a protective formation. They were ready for whatever came next. "We're not running," Jack replied, his eyes locked on Viper. "And we're not backing down." The Serpents sized them up, clearly trying to gauge their chances. Viper looked at his men, and for a brief moment, Jack could see a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The Serpents weren't used to this kind of resistance. They had assumed Jack and his crew would back off, that they would cower in fear. But that wasn't going to happen. Jack wasn't afraid of them, and neither were the bikers. The leader of the Serpents took a slow step back, as if considering the situation. Then, without warning, he motioned for his men to move forward. Jack's pulse quickened, and his hand instinctively went to his sidearm. The bikers tensed, preparing for the worst. But before the first move was made, a voice broke through the tension. "Stop." It was Aisha. She had stepped forward, her small figure standing in front of the bikers, her eyes determined but still filled with fear. Jack's heart stopped for a moment as he looked at her. She had always been strong, but now, in this moment, she was showing a strength that none of them had expected. "Aisha, get back," Jack said urgently, but she didn't move. She stood her ground. "No," she said firmly, her voice small but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere." The Serpents paused, their eyes flicking to Aisha. There was something about the sight of the young girl standing up to them that seemed to stop them in their tracks. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Jack knew Aisha had been through hell, but he never realized just how much strength she had inside her. It was almost as if she had taken her father's spirit with her, the same spirit that had once kept Jack going. Viper looked at her, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his men. "Take her," he growled. It was a command. But before anyone could move, Jack's voice cut through the air like a blade. "No one's touching her." He stepped forward, his body tense with readiness. The Serpents froze. The challenge was clear. "You want to take her," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll have to go through me first." The air crackled with tension as Viper's men looked between their leader and the bikers. The silence was deafening. Jack could feel the heat of the standoff, his senses sharpened to the smallest movements. This was it. They were at a crossroads, and there was no turning back. The Serpents weren't used to being challenged. They were used to getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. But Jack wasn't going to let them have Aisha. Not today. Viper stepped forward again, this time with a dark smile on his face. "You think you can stand up to us?" he spat. "We'll see how long your little gang lasts." Jack didn't move, his eyes never leaving Viper's. "It doesn't matter how long we last," Jack said, his voice steady and unwavering. "What matters is that you're not taking her." The tension in the air was palpable. Aisha's heart raced in her chest, but but she didn't move. She had to believe that Jack would protect her. She had to trust him. Jack's grip tightened on his gun as he prepared for what was about to happen. His crew was ready, every one of them poised for action. The Serpents had made their move. Now it was time for Jack and his crew to make theirs. And then, without warning, everything happened at once. Viper's men lunged forward, but Jack was faster. He drew his weapon, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, and for a brief moment, the Serpents hesitated. But that hesitation was all it took. The bikers surged forward, their movements swift and controlled. There was no chaos, no panic. They were a well-oiled machine, moving as one. Jack's eyes were locked on Viper, but he could hear the sounds of the fight behind him. The Serpents were struggling to keep up with the bikers, their movements slow and disjointed. This wasn't their territory. This wasn't their fight. But it was Jack's, and he wasn't going to lose. The fight raged on, but Jack's focus never wavered. He knew that Aisha's safety was the most important thing. And with his crew by his side, he knew they would protect her with everything they had. The Serpents had made a mistake. They had underestimated the bikers, and now they were going to pay for it. Jack stood his ground, his weapon raised, ready for whatever came next. The battle wasn't over yet, but Jack was ready. The street was alive with chaos, every sound magnified by adrenaline. The Serpents clashed with the bikers in a storm of shouts, footsteps, and raw determination. Jack kept his stance firm, his eyes locked on Viper, knowing this moment would decide everything. He had to create enough time for his crew to gain the upper hand. He had to make sure Aisha stayed safe. She was behind him, shielded by Wrench and two other bikers who stood like walls of leather and resolve. The girl's breath was quick and shallow, but she did not cry. She simply watched, her small hands clenched tightly together. Jack could feel her fear. He could feel her father's spirit in her eyes. The battle raged around them. The bikers fought with precision, relying on strength and experience rather than reckless force. The Serpents were fast, but sloppy, fueled more by anger than strategy. Phantom disarmed one of them with a swift motion, sending his weapon skidding across the pavement. Wrench overpowered another, pinning him to the ground as the man thrashed in frustration. But Viper was different. He moved with deliberate intent, cutting across the fight as if searching for an opportunity. His gaze flicked to Aisha, and in that split second, Jack understood exactly what he was trying to do. Viper wanted to get past him. He wanted the girl. Jack stepped forward, blocking Viper's line of sight completely. "You're not getting near her," Jack said, his voice steady and cold. Viper smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting in a twisted grin. "You can't protect her forever." "I only need to protect her today," Jack replied. "That is all that matters." Viper lunged, closing the distance in a flash of movement, but Jack was ready. He dodged the first strike, his boots gripping the asphalt as he shifted his weight. The second strike came harder, faster. Jack blocked it with his forearm, the impact vibrating up to his shoulder. The street lights flickered overhead as the two men circled each other, every move deliberate, every breath heavy with tension. Behind Jack, Aisha watched, frozen, her eyes wide. She did not understand the mechanics of fighting, but she understood fear. She understood what it meant when people stood between danger and those they loved. Jack had been that barrier since the night she ran into the biker bar. Now she finally saw what that meant. The fight between Jack and Viper escalated. Their strikes echoed in the air, each one more desperate than the last. The bikers had nearly subdued the rest of the Serpents, but none of that mattered until Jack finished what he had started. Viper charged again, his movements growing sloppy as frustration overtook him. Jack dodged to the side, using the momentum to grab Viper's jacket and shove him backward. Viper stumbled, hitting the pavement hard. Jack stood over him, his breath heavy but steady. Viper looked up, fury burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he hissed. Jack leveled his gaze, his voice low. "It is tonight." Jack didn't strike him. He didn't need to. The rest of the bikers had finally pinned down the last of the Serpents. Their weapons were confiscated, their escape routes cut off. The fight was over. The Serpents had lost. Jack stepped back, allowing Phantom and Wrench to restrain Viper. Aisha watched as the man who had chased her for so long was finally subdued. Her body relaxed, her shoulders dropping as the weight she carried eased, even just a little. Jack turned to her, his expression softening. You all right, kid? Aisha nodded slowly. Yes, she whispered, though her voice trembled. I really am. Jack felt something shift inside him. A mix of pride, relief, and a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He knelt down, meeting her gaze. You were brave today. Braver than most grown men I know. Aisha looked down, shy but grateful. I just wanted it to stop, she murmured. I just wanted my mom to be safe. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. And she will be, he said firmly. We're not done yet, but we're getting there. The bikers regrouped, their breaths heavy but their spirits unbroken. The street was littered with signs of the fight, but there was also a sense of victory in the air. They had held their ground. They had protected Aisha, but Jack knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. There were still questions to answer. Still dangers lurking. Still truth hidden in the shadows of Aisha's past. As he stood, Jack looked toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break. Tonight was just the beginning, he thought. The real fight is still ahead. And he was ready. The dawn came quietly, the first rays of light spilling across the broken streets, turning the world around them into a quiet and peaceful scene after the chaos. The battle was over, and for now, they were safe. Jack stood by the window of the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, but the tension had loosened. The Serpents had been taken down, and they had finally secured Aisha and her mother. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. It was only a temporary victory. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his focus, and he turned to see Wrench walking into the room. It's quiet out there, Wrench said, his voice low. But we can't stay here forever. We need to keep moving. Jack nodded. He knew the situation wasn't stable. The Serpents might be down, but there were others, and they wouldn't rest until they had what they wanted. He had to make sure Aisha and her mother were safe, but it would take more than just this cabin to guarantee that. You're right, Jack said, running a hand through his hair. We leave at sunset. We head north to the next safe house. It's isolated, but it's well off the grid. We'll rest there, regroup, and figure out our next move. Wrench nodded, understanding the urgency. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had to stay ahead of the Serpents. Time was running out, and Jack knew they couldn't afford to wait. He walked over to Aisha, who was sitting at the table, her eyes fixed on the map of the area spread out before her. She had been quiet since the fight, but Jack could tell she was processing everything. The strength she had shown the night before had stayed with her. She wasn't a child who was going to break under pressure. She was stronger than most adults. Aisha, Jack said gently, his voice soft. She looked up at him, and for the first time since everything had started, Jack saw a spark of hope in her eyes. We're moving again. We'll be safe. I promised your dad I'd protect you, and I'll keep that promise. We leave tonight, all right? Aisha didn't say anything at first. She just nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the map. Jack knew she wasn't fully convinced, but there was a quiet trust in her gaze. She wasn't saying much, but she was listening. That was all he needed. You ready? Jack asked, kneeling beside her. Aisha looked up, her eyes locked on his. I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice firm. It was then that Jack realized just how much this girl had grown in the past few days. She wasn't the same frightened child who had run to the bikers for help. She had become a fighter. Good, Jack replied with a small smile. Let's get you and your mom to safety. The rest of the bikers were already preparing to leave, gathering their gear, checking their bikes, and making sure everything was ready for the next leg of their journey. Jack didn't waste any time. He was moving quickly, his mind already set on the safe house up north. It was a long ride, but it was the only option. As the sun began to set, Jack led the group out of the cabin. The road ahead was dark, and the trees on either side cast long shadows. The quiet was unsettling, but it was a familiar kind of quiet. The kind Jack had grown used to over the years. The kind that always came before something big. Aisha was once again riding with Wrench, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She was quieter now, but Jack could see the determination in her face. She was ready to keep moving, ready to stay strong. Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, his senses alert. He could feel the tension building, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. They had made it this far. They couldn't stop now. As the night deepened, the road stretched out before them, dark and empty. Jack knew they were heading into the unknown. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. They were still moving forward. And as long as they kept moving, they would be okay. The miles passed by in silence, each one taking them further from the danger that had chased them for so long. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the road as the bikers rode in formation, their engines humming in unison. Jack didn't look back. He didn't need to. He trusted his crew. He trusted that they were all in this together. They had already proven that. They had faced down the Serpents and come out on top. They could face anything now. After hours of riding, they finally reached the outskirts of the small town where the next safe house was located. The place was hidden, tucked away behind rows of old, abandoned buildings. The lights of the town were distant, barely visible in the dark. Jack led the group off the main road, weaving through the narrow streets until they reached the hidden house. It was nothing special, just a small, nondescript building. But to Jack, it was a sanctuary. They had made it. For now, they parked their bikes, dismounted, and moved quickly inside, making sure to lock the door behind them. Jack took a moment to look around, ensuring the place was secure. It was small, but it would do. For now, it was home. Aisha followed him inside, her steps hesitant but steady. She looked around the dimly lit room, her eyes scanning every corner as if trying to find something familiar. Jack gave her a small smile, hoping it would reassure her. "You're safe here," he said. Aisha nodded, but Jack could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. He understood. The past few days had been a whirlwind, and she had every reason to feel unsure. But Jack was certain of one thing. No matter what, he would keep his promise. They would survive this. The cabin was quiet, the hum of the engines and the bustle of the fight now a distant memory. Jack stood by the window, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Aisha was safe, for now. But the Serpents weren't done. They were out there, somewhere, and they would come looking again. He knew it was only a matter of time. The night had passed without incident, the first real rest they had gotten in days. But Jack couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. He turned back to see Aisha sitting at the table, her small hands nervously tracing the edge of the map in front of her. She had been quiet all night, but Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The fear. It was like a storm, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to break. He walked over to her, his boots silent on the wooden floor. "You okay?" he asked gently, his voice softer than usual. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her eyes wide, as if she was searching for something, some kind of reassurance. "I'm tired," Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want it to end." Jack knelt beside her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I know, kid. I know." He paused, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't promise her that it would end soon, but he could promise that she wouldn't face it alone. "We're going to keep moving forward, Aisha. We're going to make sure you and your mom stay safe. I promise." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're really going to protect me?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Jack nodded, his expression serious. "Always," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll keep you safe. That's what I'm here for." Aisha nodded slowly, as if she was finally starting to believe him. Jack stood up and turned to the rest of the bikers, who were preparing for their next move. They were ready. They had been ready for this fight for a long time. But now, it was about more than just the Serpents. It was about keeping Aisha safe. It was about making sure she didn't have to run anymore. Jack couldn't promise that the road ahead would be easy. He couldn't promise that there wouldn't be more battles. But he could promise that they would keep fighting. For Aisha. For her mother. For the promise he had made to his friend, Tyrone. As the day began to break, Jack felt a shift in the air. The weight of the night was starting to lift. But there was still a long road ahead. "We're leaving soon," Jack said, his voice low but firm. The bikers were already gathering, checking their bikes and their gear, ready for the next phase of their journey. They knew it wasn't over. They knew the Serpents would come again. But Jack wasn't worried. They were ready for whatever came their way. As the group mounted their bikes and started up the engines, Jack looked over at Aisha. She was standing at the door, her small form silhouetted against the morning light. She looked stronger now, more at ease, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack saw a spark of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a start. The road ahead stretched out before them, winding through the countryside, leading them to the next safe house. They rode in silence, the engines of the bikes humming in unison, their sound filling the air like a promise. The fight wasn't over, but they were moving forward. Together, Jack glanced back at Aisha, her eyes locked on the road. Ahead, she was still young, still scarred by everything she had been through. But she was stronger now, and as long as Jack was around, she would never face the world alone. They rode on, the sun rising higher in the sky, the promise of a new day on the horizon. Jack didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had made it this far, and he would keep going, no matter what. For Aisha, for the promise, and for the future they would fight to protect.